The Vreth Collective had never lost a raid, not once in 40 years of expansion across the outer rim of known space, and Commander Kethra Voss intended to keep it that way. She stood at the center of the command bridge aboard her flagship, the Crimson Verdict, and studied the glowing tactical display in front of her with calm and practiced eyes. The target was called Kepler's Reach, a small, pale, dust-covered rock sitting alone at the very edge of the contested fringe, far from any major human settlement, far from any reinforcement fleet, and far from anything that any reasonable military power would consider worth defending. It was, in every measurable way, nothing. The long-range scans had confirmed this conclusion 3 separate times over the past 2 days. Low energy readings. Outdated defense architecture. A thermal signature suggesting no more than a dozen warm bodies spread across a handful of grey prefab modules half buried in the dust of the planet's surface. The human Terran Accord had planted this outpost here years ago, and by every available sign, they had largely forgotten it existed. Kethra traced one clawed finger along the edge of the glowing display and allowed herself a thin smile, the sharp, narrow kind that her crew recognized immediately. It was the smile she wore right before easy work. 3 corvettes, 1 troop carrier, 200 shock troops, she said, her voice flat and certain. We will be done before their command center even finishes drafting a distress call. Her second-in-command, Sub-Commander Reth, dipped his broad head from across the bridge. Scans show perhaps a dozen human personnel on the surface, Commander, possibly fewer if some are in the lower sections of the structure. It makes no difference, Kethra replied, turning away from the display. This is a mining outpost, a supply point, nothing more. The Terran Accord does not station soldiers on forgotten rocks. They station engineers and data clerks and maintenance workers, people who carry tools, not weapons. Reth said nothing, because there was nothing useful to add. And to be fair to Kethra Voss, she was not entirely wrong. She had simply not been told the full truth about Kepler's Reach, and neither had the intelligence officers who had compiled the report she was reading from. The outpost's official designation in the Terran Accord's public registry listed it as a Class C mineral survey station, staffed by a single permanent resident under the job title of maintenance custodian. That job title was one of the finest pieces of creative record-keeping in the entire history of human military administration. Kethra had won 43 engagements in her career, every single one of them, from small border skirmishes to full colonial annexations. She had built her reputation on speed and precision. She studied her targets carefully, moved with overwhelming force, and left no room for the enemy to adapt or react. It was a formula that had never failed her. It was about to meet something the formula had never accounted for. The Crimson Verdict dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Kepler system with a deep shudder of displaced energy, pulling its 3 escort corvettes through in tight formation. The troop carrier, a wide, heavy vessel named the Iron Step, translated out 2 seconds later, its hold packed with drop pods and 200 of the Vreth Collective's finest shock troops. All ships confirm position, Reth reported from his board. We are well outside their detection range, Commander. The approach is clean. Good, Kethra said, settling into her command chair. Begin atmospheric descent. I want the drop pods away within 40 minutes and boots on the ground within the hour. By the time their relay stations transmit anything, it will already be over. The fleet moved with quiet confidence, sliding through the dark toward the pale world below. Kepler's Reach grew larger on the visual feeds, a flat, brown-grey landscape under a pale and distant sun, broken here and there by low ridges of cracked stone. The outpost itself was visible on the thermal overlay, a cluster of modules, a few communication towers, one access road leading nowhere particular, and a pair of cargo lifts sunk into the rock. No satellites tracked them. No weapon platforms powered up. No energy shield flickered to life. Nothing moved, nothing fired, nothing broadcast a warning. It looked completely, entirely abandoned. Inside the outpost, in a small mess room that smelled like instant coffee and recycled air and a faint trace of machine oil that never quite went away, a man sat at a metal table and ate reconstituted eggs with a steel fork. He was not a young man. He looked, specifically, like something that had been left out in bad weather for several decades and had simply refused to stop working. His face was deeply lined, his jaw was wide and set hard, and his hands, wrapped around the fork with a grip that was frankly unnecessary for eating eggs, were enormous, scarred, and calloused in ways that told a long and not always pleasant story. His hair was grey, cut close to his skull. His eyes were pale grey as well, and they moved slowly and steadily around any room he entered, cataloguing exits and surfaces and distances with the quiet, automatic habit of a man who had been doing that for so long he no longer noticed he was doing it. His name was Master Sergeant Elias Harrow. Most people who had passed through his program simply called him Gravel, not to his face, at least not more than once, because his voice sounded like two large rocks being ground together, and because his entire personality seemed to be constructed from something similarly hard and unyielding. The outpost's outer proximity alarm tripped at precisely 0642. It was a soft alarm, a steady, low pulse from the relay panel mounted on the far wall of the mess room, the kind of tone that announced something had crossed the outer detection perimeter. It was designed to be noticeable without being loud. Harrow noticed it. He did not react to it the way a person might be expected to react to the news that a Vreth assault fleet had entered the system. He reached across the table, picked up the paper book he had set down when the eggs were ready, and dog-eared the page he had been reading with great care. He set the book down neatly. He took one final bite of eggs. He chewed. He swallowed. Then he stood up, walked to the relay panel, and looked at the sensor readout for exactly 4 seconds. 3 corvettes. 1 troop carrier, Vreth military class. Atmospheric approach vector already committed. 200 life signs packed in the carrier hold. Harrow looked at this information the way a very experienced plumber looks at a burst pipe, not with shock or panic, but with the mild, dry irritation of someone who has already seen this exact problem before and knows precisely how long it is going to take to fix. He crossed the room to the secondary communications board, the one connected to the deep channel relay, the frequency that carried down through 60 meters of solid rock into the tunnel network below the outpost, and pressed the transmit key. "Live exercise," he said, his voice completely level. "Weapons are hot. Don't embarrass me." He released the key, walked back to the table, picked up his coffee, and took a long, slow sip. 60 meters beneath the surface of Kepler's Reach, in a network of tunnels carved from raw rock and lined with old reinforced steel, 60 human beings heard those words come through their earpieces and went absolutely still. They had been underground for 68 hours at that point. 3 days with no proper sleep, no warm meals, no contact with the outside world, and no certainty about what was coming next. They were in the final stage of the Tier 0 assessment, the Terran Accord's most demanding Special Forces selection program, a course designed by Harrow himself over 19 years and refined until it reliably broke 9 out of every 10 people who attempted it. The ones who made it through were not superhuman. They were simply people who had decided, somewhere in the first 24 hours of absolute misery, that stopping was worse than continuing, and who had kept deciding that every hour since. Corporal Yua Chen received the transmission and moved without a word. Her hand found the knife at her hip and checked the edge by feel in the dark, a habit so deeply trained it bypassed thought entirely. Private Deo Osei let out a low, completely inappropriate laugh that echoed briefly off the tunnel walls. He was a very large man with a very durable attitude toward suffering, and the news that real enemies had arrived seemed to improve his mood rather than damage it. Recruit Sable Vance felt her stomach flip hard. She was the youngest in the group, born on a space habitat and raised without ever once seeing a live alien up close, and somewhere above her, 200 of them were on their way down. She pressed one hand flat against the cold tunnel wall, breathed through her nose once, twice, 3 times, and then brought her rifle up and checked the charge indicator. It read full. Above them all, on the surface, the Vreth drop pods separated from the iron step and began their screaming descent toward the dusty ground below. They were coming down fast, confident, and completely certain that what waited for them was a forgotten outpost full of people who had no idea what was about to happen. They were half right. The people of Kepler's Reach had known exactly what was about to happen for the past 6 minutes. The drop pods hit the surface of Kepler's Reach like a row of iron fists. They struck the ground in a tight pattern, exactly as planned, exactly as drilled, the armored shells cracking open in sequence and releasing Vreth shock troops onto the dusty surface in clean, orderly formations. The soldiers moved immediately. Helmets sealed, weapons raised, spreading out in a wide perimeter around the landing zone with the smooth, practiced motion of people who had rehearsed this exact kind of deployment many times before. Squad leader Dreveth was first out of his pod, and his initial read of the outpost matched everything the scans had told him. Low buildings. Dust. Silence. A few external lights still running on automatic timers, casting pale yellow pools across the flat ground. Nothing moved in the courtyard. Nothing made a sound except the wind pushing grit across the bare rock surface. "Structure is cold," he reported back to the Crimson Verdict. "No movement detected. Beginning sweep of outer perimeter." In orbit, Commander Kethra Voss leaned back in her command chair with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a plan execute itself perfectly. Understood. Proceed to the main entrance. Secure the communications relay first. It was going to be a short morning. For the first 12 minutes, she was right. The forward element moved through the outer ring of the outpost without any trouble at all. No resistance, no alarm, nothing but dust and the low hum of life support systems running on minimal power. The outer doors were not even locked. Dreveth walked through the first one with his shoulder and found a short corridor leading into a storage area packed with equipment crates and one very old coffee machine that had clearly been used that very morning. He noted that detail and kept moving. Outer ring secure, he reported. Moving to interior section. Then the forward scout found the first hatch. It was set into the floor of the main corridor, a heavy metal panel, flush with the ground, the kind of thing common on mining vessels for accessing lower maintenance levels. It was not unusual. It was not alarming. Dreveth barely glanced at it as he stepped over it and continued down the corridor. The hatch opened silently behind him. Something came up out of it very fast, and 2 of his soldiers were gone before anyone had time to process what had happened. There was no sound. There was no shot fired. One moment they were there, moving in formation, and the next moment 2 gaps existed in the line where 2 soldiers had been standing. Dreveth spun around, weapon raised, and saw nothing, just the open hatch and the dark drop below it. Contact, he shouted into his communicator. Forward element, I have 2 soldiers. Wait, 3, contact, unknown type, unknown position, requesting. The hatch closed again on its own. The tunnel network beneath Kepler's reach was not what most people imagined when they heard the words mining tunnels. Most mining tunnels were dug to get somewhere, to reach an or deposit, to install a pipe, to access a lower level of rock. They went from one point to another and they did what tunnels were supposed to do, which was get you there. These tunnels did not work that way. Harrow had spent 19 years redesigning and expanding this network, and the result was something that would have confused and frightened a professional cartographer. Corridors branched into dead ends that were not quite dead ends. They had false walls that opened inward if you pressed the right spot. Shafts dropped into lower chambers that looped back around to where you started, but rotated 90 degrees so you could not tell. Certain hatches connected to rooms 3 corridors away through hidden crawl spaces that no Vreth soldier, built wider through the shoulders than any human, could fit through. Every trainee who had spent 3 days in these tunnels knew them the way they knew their own hands. Every Vreth soldier stepping into them for the first time was already lost and did not know it yet. Yua Chen moved through the crawl space above Corridor 7 with her knife in her hand and her body flat and silent against the metal surface. She had tracked the 4-soldier Vreth squad below her for the past 90 seconds by sound alone, their boots on the hard floor, the hiss of their breathing gear, the small metallic click of their weapon safeties, and she knew exactly where the corridor turned, exactly where the ceiling dropped, and exactly where they would have to slow down and bunch together. She waited. She was very good at waiting. The squad reached the low section of the ceiling and compressed together without thinking about it. It was an automatic response, the kind of movement that happens before the brain sends a formal instruction. Chen dropped through the maintenance hatch above them at that exact moment, moving fast and low and completely without noise. And by the time the first soldier had registered her presence, the second one was already down and the third was trying very hard to understand what had just happened to his wrist. The 4th soldier attempted to raise his weapon. Chen used a technique that Harrow had developed, named, and taught to every class for the past 11 years. It was fast, it was efficient, and it put the soldier on the floor with his hands secured behind him using a length of standard issue cable before he could produce any sound worth reporting. She looked at the 4 secured soldiers for a moment. Then she moved back into the tunnels without saying a single word. On the surface, Dreveth's situation had not improved. He had lost 11 soldiers in 14 minutes, and he still had not seen a single enemy. He had heard things, footsteps that came from directions that made no sense, the brief scrape of metal on metal from somewhere above him, one short and undignified yelp from a soldier in the next corridor who was subsequently discovered zip-tied to a ventilation bracket, but he had not actually seen anyone. He reported this to the Crimson Verdict with the careful, neutral tone of a soldier who was beginning to feel something very uncomfortable but was not yet ready to call it by its correct name. "Commander," he said, "we have encountered resistance of an unknown." Unknown. Kethra's voice was sharp. "You have 200 soldiers on the ground, Dreveth. What kind of resistance could possibly be?" "I have 189 soldiers operational, Commander." A pause from orbit. Say again. 189 operational, Dreveth repeated. 11 personnel are unaccounted for. They are not reporting casualties. Their vital signs are stable, but they are not responding to communication, and their position trackers are. He stopped. Their trackers are showing them as being in the same corridor, Commander. The same corridor, in 5 different places at the same time, which is not. Another pause, longer this time. That is not possible, Kethra said flatly. No, Commander, Dreveth agreed. It is not. Harrow walked out of the back of the outpost through a maintenance hatch that was not on any map the Vreth had scanned, carrying a combat baton in his right hand and a thermos of coffee in his left. He walked without hurrying. He moved along the outer wall of the nearest module with his back close to the surface, watching the ground and the sky in turn with the slow, steady sweeps of a man who had been doing exactly this for most of his adult life. He turned 2 corners, crossed a section of open ground while a Vreth patrol was looking in a different direction, and settled himself into a position behind a large piece of mining equipment, an old drill housing, wide enough to sit behind comfortably. That gave him a clear view of the main landing zone. He took a sip of coffee. He watched. He was not rushing because he did not need to rush. The trainees were doing exactly what they had been trained to do, and the Vreth were doing exactly what anyone entering that tunnel network without a map and without a guide would do, which was get steadily, irreversibly confused while their numbers quietly shrank. He had built this course to break soldiers who thought they were ready. These soldiers had not even known they were entering a course. A Vreth patrol of 6 moved past his position at a distance of roughly 20 meters, alert, scanning, weapons up, and he watched them pass with the detached, professional attention of a man observing a training drill. He noted their formation, their spacing, the direction their heads tracked, and the small moments where their attention dipped or shifted. He took another sip of coffee. Then his earpiece crackled, and Retha's voice, relayed from orbit through the Vreth command frequency that Harrow had been passively monitoring since the fleet arrived, came through very clearly. Commander, we have lost contact with the forward element. All 12 of them. Kethra's response was not immediate. All 12, she said at last. All 12, Commander. In 12 minutes. Harrow heard the silence that followed and recognized it well. It was the silence of a commander who had just realized, for the very first time, that the morning was not going to be short after all. He finished his coffee. He stood up. He started walking toward the Vreth perimeter, not away from it, but toward it, at a steady and unhurried pace, with the baton loose in his hand. Above him, in orbit, Kethra Voss leaned forward in her command chair for the first time since the operation had begun. Something in the data in front of her was telling her that her intelligence report was wrong. It was going to take her a little while longer to understand exactly how wrong. The Vreth Collective shock troops were not cowards and they were not fools. They were well-trained, well-armed, experienced soldiers who had taken part in dozens of successful operations across the contested fringe. They had stormed defended positions, broken organized resistance, and operated under fire in hostile environments on multiple worlds. They were, by any reasonable military standard, very good at their jobs. None of that was helping them right now. The problem was not the enemy's weapons, it was the ground itself. Every corridor had too many doors. Every door had too many sides. Every shaft connected to a level that should not have existed based on the surface dimensions of the building above. Patrols that entered a section of tunnels and turned left should have come out in the storage bay, but they came out in the equipment room, or back where they started, or somewhere entirely new that the building's outer walls insisted could not be there. 2 full squads had been sent to reinforce the forward element, and had instead found each other in the dark, nearly engaged one another, and were now standing back-to-back in a room with 4 doors that all led to the same corridor. Dreveth had stopped filing position updates because he no longer knew where he was. The Vreth troops were not being massacred. They were being taken apart, piece by piece, with calm and deliberate precision, removed from the count 1 or 2 at a time, their equipment stripped, their communicators tagged with false signals that sent their position data somewhere unhelpful. It was not a battle. It was a lesson, and the lesson had a very clear curriculum. Yua Chen did not think of herself as a violent person, which was an interesting self-assessment for someone who was currently on her 11th engagement of the morning. She was not large, not by any standard, and especially not by the standard of the Vreth soldiers she had been working through, most of whom had a significant size advantage over her in at least 2 physical dimensions. What she had instead of size was precision. She had speed, which was different from quickness, Quickness was reflex, but speed was knowing where to be before anyone else did. And she had the technique Harrow called the apology, which he had invented, named, and taught to every Tier 0 class for the past 8 years. The name came from Harrow's explanation. You get close, you make a mistake, you apologize, and by the time they realize the apology was the technique, they are on the floor. A Vreth heavy weapon specialist, a large, four-armed soldier carrying a plasma projector that could have taken out the outer wall of the outpost in 2 shots, came around a corner in Tunnel 9 and found the corridor empty. He stopped, checked his scanner, confirmed the motion sensor had triggered, and swept the corridor carefully with his weapon. There was nothing there. He took 1 step forward. The ventilation grate above him opened. Chen dropped from a shaft, landed behind him, and executed the apology in the time it took the soldier to begin turning. The plasma projector hit the floor separately from the soldier, who hit the floor an instant later, and remained there, secured, with his forearms arranged in a position that would have looked uncomfortable to anyone who thought about it. Chen picked up the plasma projector. She looked at it for a moment. She set it back down, because carrying a weapon that big would slow her down and she had places to be. She went back into the ventilation shaft. Private Deo Osei had been shot twice. This was not ideal, but it was also not, in his personal assessment, a reason to stop doing what he was doing. The shots had been from a Vreth sidearm at close range, low power bolts, the kind designed to incapacitate quickly rather than cause serious damage, and both had hit him in areas that Harrow had once pointed to on a human body diagram and described as available for temporary inconvenience. The left shoulder, the upper right side, between the ribs and the hip. Both spots hurt a great deal. Osei kept moving. The Vreth heavy infantry specialist who had fired the shots was, understandably, not prepared for what happened next. He was a decorated soldier who had put down 4 enemies in the field with those exact shots from that exact range and never once had any of them kept coming. He fired again, sent a mass, which should have finished it, and watched the large human take the shot, stagger slightly, shake his head like a man walking through an annoying rain, and then close the remaining distance between them with an expression that the soldier would later describe in writing as unreasonably determined. The fight that followed lasted 11 seconds. Osei won it with a combination of training, stubbornness, and the genuine personal philosophy that discomfort was not an emergency. It was just weather, and weather passed. He secured the soldier, checked his own wounds with a quick and experienced hand, determined that they were unpleasant but manageable, and then laughed, that same low, rolling laugh that echoed off the tunnel walls, before picking up his rifle and moving on. The situation that Sable Vance found herself in was not in any of Harrow's lesson plans, which meant it was the kind of situation he would have approved of most. She had been moving alone through the eastern tunnels when she took a wrong turn, not a serious wrong turn, just a directional error of the kind anyone could make in a dark and deliberately confusing network of corridors, and had come up through a surface hatch into the open air behind the outpost secondary module instead of the equipment bay. 2 Vreth scouts were standing 6 meters away. They saw her at the same moment she saw them. For a long, strange second, all 3 of them simply looked at each other. Vance ran the options very fast. She could fire, but her rifle on stun would need 2 clean shots per target and they were both raising their own weapons. She could go back down the hatch, but she would be exposed through the whole movement. She could. She opened her mouth and spoke in Vreth trade tongue. It was not good Vreth trade tongue. She had been teaching herself from recordings in her spare time, the way some people learn to play instruments or draw, out of curiosity, because the sounds were interesting, because knowing things was its own reward. Her pronunciation was approximate and her vocabulary was about 90 words wide. But she said, as clearly as she could, "Weapons down, you are surrounded, I do not want to hurt you, come with me and you will be safe." The 2 scouts stared at her. The Vreth language coming out of this small, dirty, sleep-deprived human in a dark tunnel was almost certainly not something they had expected to hear at any point in their military careers. They hesitated. Vance did not hesitate. She moved forward 2 steps, kept her voice level, repeated the phrase about being surrounded, and pointed firmly at the ground in the universal gesture that needs no translation. The scouts looked at each other. They put their weapons down. Vance zip-tied them, both of them, efficient and neat, with the cable from her kit and walked them back inside through the hatch. She did not let herself shake until she was back in the tunnel and the hatch was closed above her. Then she allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of shaking. Then she moved on. Kethra had deployed her reserve unit. She had not wanted to do it. Sending reserves into an operation that was supposed to be a 1-hour sweep was the kind of decision that looked bad in after-action reports. But she had now lost contact with 130 of her 200 ground troops, not dead. The vital signs confirmed they were alive, but secured somewhere inside or below that outpost and not coming out, and the ones still active were filing reports that made very little structural sense. She deployed her personal guard, 20 soldiers who had never been defeated, the finest close-quarters fighters the Vreth Collective had produced in a generation, and pointed them at the courtyard in front of the main outpost entrance. "Find me whoever is running this operation," she said. "Find me their commander and bring them to me." 20 soldiers dropped to the surface and converged on the courtyard. They found a single human man standing in the open, in the dust and the wind, holding a combat baton in one hand and what appeared to be an empty thermos in the other. He looked at the 20 soldiers with the same expression a teacher uses when a student has finally, after many attempts, managed to find the correct classroom. He set the thermos down on a nearby crate with great care. He rolled his neck once, a slow, deliberate movement that produced an audible sound even at distance. Then he looked at the 20 soldiers and waited for them to come to him. In orbit, Kethra watched the thermal feeds with narrowed eyes. This was not going the way it was supposed to go. It was, in fact, going in a direction that she had no prior experience navigating, and the uncomfortable feeling that had been growing in her chest for the past 20 minutes was now large enough to have a name. She was watching a man with a stick wait for 20 elite soldiers to attack him, and something in the way he was standing made her deeply, specifically uncertain about how this was going to end. The 20 soldiers spread into a wide half circle around the courtyard and closed in with professional patience. They were not rushing. Elite fighters never rushed. Rushing was for people who had not been trained well enough to know better. They came in slow and steady, cutting off exit angles, reading the ground, watching the lone human in the center for the first movement that would tell them what kind of fighter he was. What they saw was a man standing very still. He was not in a combat stance, not exactly. He was just standing the way some people stand when they are completely comfortable in a place they know very well. His feet were shoulder-width apart. His weight was balanced. The baton in his hand was loose, not tight, held the way a person holds something they have been holding for so long that it feels like a part of the arm. His eyes moved from face to face around the half circle with a slow, calm sweep. He was not afraid. This was the detail that the first soldier to reach him noted later, when he was able to speak clearly again, that the human showed absolutely no sign of fear, and that this was, in retrospect, a piece of information he should have thought about more carefully before initiating contact. The first soldier came in fast from the left, leading with his weapon arm, a perfectly executed opening strike, the kind that had put opponents down in 3 previous engagements. Harrow stepped inside it. He moved without any waste at all, 1 short step to close the distance, 1 redirect of the arm, and then the baton came around in a tight arc that ended on the back of the soldier's knee with a sound like a bat hitting a fence post. The soldier went down. Harrow was already moving to the next one. The second and third came in together, which was the correct response to what they had seen. 2 angles, coordinated, no gap between them. Harrow did not try to split the difference between them. He committed to the soldier on the right, took a glancing strike from the one on the left across the back of the shoulder. He did not flinch, he just absorbed it the way old stone absorbs weather, and put the right side soldier on the ground hard enough to take him out of the count entirely. The one on the left hit him twice more before Harrow turned. Both shots landed. Harrow turned anyway. The fight lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds by the recording's timestamp. It was not clean. It was not the kind of fight that looked good in training demonstrations, because training demonstrations were designed to show technique at its best, and this was technique under real conditions, which meant Harrow took strikes, absorbed damage, moved through pain without registering it as a reason to stop, and kept working. He did not move like someone half his age. He moved like someone who knew exactly what his body could and could not do and had built his approach around that knowledge rather than fighting against it. When he could not be fast, he was angled. When he could not be powerful, he was precise. When 2 soldiers came at him from directions that gave him no clean option, he used them against each other, redirected one into the path of the other's strike and let them solve that problem while he moved. By the 2-minute mark, 9 of the 20 were secured on the ground. By the 3-minute mark, 15 were down. The last 5 pulled back and tried to regroup, which was the smart move, and also the move Harrow had been waiting for. When they grouped up, they clustered. When they clustered, they became a formation, and a formation had a geometry, and geometries had weak points, and Harrow had been exploiting weak points in formation since before the youngest of these soldiers was born. He walked into the cluster from the most awkward possible angle, the one that put him inside their effective reach before any of them could swing cleanly, and he took the 4 minutes and 11 seconds to their conclusion. He stood in the courtyard with 20 secured soldiers around him and breathed hard through his nose for a moment. He was bleeding from 2 places. His left eye was swelling. His shoulder, the one that had taken the repeated strikes, was going to be a spectacular color by morning. He reached down, picked up his thermos from the crate where he had set it, shook it to confirm it was empty, and looked mildly disappointed. Then his earpiece crackled, the open channel, the one the Vreth command frequency was broadcasting on, and a voice came through that he recognized from the interception he had been monitoring all morning. Commander Kethra Voss. Her voice was very controlled. You, in the courtyard. I am the commander of the Vreth strike force currently in your system. I would like to. I know who you are, Harrow said. His voice was rougher than usual, which was saying something. You can talk. I'm listening. A pause from orbit. What is this place? Kethra asked. Her voice was still controlled, but only just. What are you people? This is not a mining outpost. Our intelligence. Your intelligence was reading the paperwork, Harrow said. Paperwork says what we want it to say. Another pause, longer. Then what is this place? Harrow looked around the courtyard, at the 20 secured elite soldiers, at the outpost modules, at the dust and the pale sky above. He thought about the 60 trainees in the tunnels below, and the 160 plus Vreth soldiers that those 60 trainees had, over the past 90 minutes, systematically taken apart. He thought about how to explain what Kepler's reach was to someone who had never seen it before. Remedial instruction, he said. The trainees came up from the tunnels in the next 20 minutes. They came up in ones and twos through the various surface hatches, dirty and tired and moving with the careful, deliberate step of people who had been operating at full intensity on almost no sleep for 3 days straight. Some of them were bleeding. All of them were functional. Every single one of them had done their job. The final count, confirmed through the afternoon, of the original 200 Vreth shock troops, 178 were secured alive inside or beneath the outpost. 14 more were wounded but stable, secured in the outpost's main corridor. 8 were unaccounted for. They had, it turned out, retreated to the landing zone on foot and were sitting behind a large boulder approximately 400 meters from the drop site, having a very quiet and private crisis about their career choices. Nobody had been killed. This was not an accident. Harrow had been very specific about this in his transmission. The words weapons are hot in his program did not mean kill. They meant engage at full capability, which in a Tier 0 context meant subdue, secure, and account for. Killing was the last tool in the box, not the first. Harrow had strong opinions about soldiers who confused those two things. The trainees assembled in the courtyard, behind Harrow, in a rough and tired group. Kethra was still on the open channel. Harrow looked at the group of them, filthy, bruised, running on nothing but grit and stubbornness, and then looked up at the sky as though he could see the crimson verdict directly above him. You asked what this place is, he said into the channel. These are my students. They are 70 hours into a 72-hour final assessment. He paused. You just gave them their practical exam. I'd say they passed. Osei was standing 3 people to Harrow's right. He had a bandage on his shoulder and another on his ribs. He was grinning. Chen was beside him, as still and quiet as she always was, her knife back at her hip. Vance was near the back of the group, and she was not grinning. She was too tired for that, but she was standing straight, and her eyes were clear, and she was still there, which was everything Harrow asked of anyone. There was a long silence from the crimson verdict. Then Kethra's second-in-command, Sub-Commander Reth, whose voice had taken on a quality that could only be described as genuinely shaken, said very quietly into the bridge feed, not intending it to transmit, but the channel was open and it transmitted anyway. Commander, if this is their training facility, what are their actual combat soldiers like? Kethra had no answer. She stared at the courtyard feed for a very long time and said nothing at all. Below her, on the dusty surface of Kepler's reach, Harrow looked at his empty thermos one more time with genuine regret. He was going to need more coffee. It had been a long morning, and the paperwork alone was going to take all afternoon. The Vreth Collective had expected many possible responses to their raid on Kepler's reach. They had prepared for a formal protest through diplomatic channels, a strongly worded communication from the Terran Accord's Foreign Affairs Office, full of heavy language about territorial violations and consequences. They had prepared for a counter-military action, a retaliatory strike, a show of force, a fleet deployment meant to demonstrate that the Accord would not absorb aggression quietly. They had even prepared for a media campaign. Humans were, in the collective's experience, enthusiastic about broadcasting their grievances to the wider galactic community when they felt wronged. They had not prepared for what actually happened. The Terran Accord's official response arrived exactly 48 hours after the raid, delivered through the standard diplomatic relay without ceremony and without any indication of how extraordinary its contents were going to be. It read, in full, "The Terran Accord acknowledges the presence of Vreth collective military forces at the Kepler's Reach survey installation on the date of the 4th. All 200 personnel have been treated for injuries where required, provided with food and water, and are ready for collection at the installation's primary landing pad at any time convenient to the collective's transport schedule. The Accord considers this matter a training incident and requires no further action on the part of the Vreth collective. We wish you safe travels." That was the entire response.
No protest.
No threat. No demand for reparations or formal apology. No fleet movement. 200 soldiers, including the collective's most elite personal guard unit, the one with the unbroken record, had been captured, treated, fed, and were now sitting on a landing pad waiting for a ride home like people who had taken the wrong transport to the wrong destination and were mildly inconvenienced about it. A training incident. The galactic community did not react loudly, because the galactic community had learned over the years that reacting loudly to human military matters tended to draw attention to one's own military vulnerabilities. But in the quiet channels, the diplomatic backrooms, the intelligence briefings, the private communications between fleet commanders across a dozen different species, the same question circulated in many different languages, all asking the same thing. A training incident? 200 of their soldiers? A training incident? Commander Kethra Voss submitted her after-action report to the Vreth War Council 10 days after the raid. It was 340 pages long, which was approximately 330 pages longer than any after-action report she had ever filed before. The summary section, the part that council members read when they did not have time for the full document, was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph described the operational failure in precise and unsparing terms. 200 personnel deployed. 0 objectives achieved. 0 enemies neutralized. Full unit captured by what the Terran Accord officially classified as a student assessment program. The second paragraph was the one that circulated. The intelligence community of the collective must conduct a full and immediate reassessment of all human frontier installations before any future operational planning takes place. What we classify as a remote outpost, the Terran Accord classifies as a classroom. What we classify as a soft target, they have constructed into a controlled training environment. We do not yet know how many such installations exist, what level of capability their students represent upon graduation, or what their actual combat deployments look like if this is the entry-level standard. Until we have answers to these questions, no human installation of any size or apparent significance should be considered a low-risk target. Recommend indefinite operational pause in the contested fringe pending full intelligence review. The War Council approved the pause without debate. It was the first time in 40 years they had paused anything. Sable Vance officially passed the Tier 0 assessment on the morning following the raid. She stood in the outpost's main corridor with the rest of the surviving candidates and listened to Harrow deliver the same short speech he gave every class. Not congratulatory, not warm, but honest in the specific way that Harrow was always honest, which was directly and without softening. He told them they had passed because they had kept going when stopping was the easier option, and that this was the only thing the program had ever actually been testing for. He told them the hard part was not over because the hard part was never over. He told them to get cleaned up because they smelled terrible. That was the speech. Vance wrote in her personal log that night, the first entry in 72 hours because the tunnels did not have good riding conditions, and she wrote 2 things. The first was a full account of the raid, detailed and careful, because she had decided she wanted to remember it exactly as it had been. The second was a shorter note. I threw up before it started. Harrow told me that's fine. He said the ones who don't feel fear are the ones you have to watch. The ones who feel it and go anyway are the ones you want next to you. She closed the log and slept for 11 hours, which was the longest uninterrupted sleep she had ever had in her adult life. Deo Osei was promoted to Corporal 2 weeks after passing assessment. At the ceremony, He was permitted to name his new issued combat knife, which was a Tier 0 tradition Harrow had started years ago on the grounds that soldiers who name their equipment take better care of it. Osane named his without hesitation. He called it unreasonable persistence. Yua Chen was promoted to sergeant and posted to the Accord's 3rd Rapid Response Unit, where she went on to establish a reputation that her commanding officers described in various reports with the words effective, quiet, alarming, and she does what. The Vreth Collective's formal request for a non-aggression accord with the Terran Accord arrived 7 weeks after the raid. It was, by the standards of interstellar diplomacy, an unusually fast development. These things normally took years of back-channel negotiation before anyone committed anything to an official document. The speed, according to the Accord's diplomatic analysts, suggested a level of internal urgency on the Vreth side that was itself a significant piece of information. The request landed on the desk of Accord High Command's Chief Diplomatic Officer on a Tuesday morning, and she forwarded it to Kepler's Reach with a short note asking for Harrow's assessment, since he was technically the most senior Accord personnel to have direct operational contact with the Vreth during the incident. Harrow's response came back in 4 sentences. Tell them they can have the Accord. Tell them the terms are standard non-aggression with mutual border respect and open channel communications. Tell them the Accord becomes effective the day they formally acknowledge the Kepler's Reach incident in their diplomatic record. Tell them to stop calling it a misunderstanding in their public statements. It was not a misunderstanding. They understood exactly what they were doing. They just did not understand us, and there is a difference. The Accord was signed 6 days later. The Vreth formal acknowledgement described the incident as an unauthorized military incursion that resulted in a decisive and complete defeat at the hands of Terran Accord personnel, which was the most honest diplomatic language the collective had used in a public document in recorded history. 3 months after the raid, a new class of Tier 0 candidates arrived at Kepler's Reach. They came in on the morning transport, 12 of them, then another 9, then a final group of 20, standing in the landing area with their gear bags and their straight backs and their careful, composed expressions that were supposed to communicate readiness but actually communicated the particular kind of nervous that very capable people feel when they know they are about to do something difficult. Harrow watched them from the doorway of the mess room, coffee in hand, in the grey early light. They were young. They were, some of them, barely past the age where most people were still deciding what they wanted to do with their lives. They had been told that this program was hard, and they had decided to come anyway, and Harrow gave them credit for that, silently, privately, not in any way they would ever see or hear from him directly. A young aide from High Command had come with the transport, and she walked over to Harrow with a tablet in her hand and a slightly uncertain expression, uncertain because she had read the after-action report, and standing next to the subject of an after-action report that was 340 pages long felt different from reading about it at a desk. "Master Sergeant," she said carefully, "I've been asked to inform you that the Vreth Collective's non-aggression accord ratification went through this morning. Officially, formally signed on their end." Harrow did not respond immediately. He looked at the new candidates on the landing pad, all 41 of them, finding their feet, looking at the grey prefab modules and the dust and the pale sky and trying to imagine what was coming. "Good," he said at last. He took a sip of coffee. "Tell their council they can have their accord," he said. "And tell them they're welcome." He turned and walked back inside the mess room. The new candidates were still looking at the outpost, this flat, dusty, unremarkable collection of grey buildings at the edge of nowhere, humming with life support systems and old recycled air and the deep, accumulated weight of 19 years of lessons. It looked like nothing worth remembering. That was, of course, entirely the point. Every great soldier who had ever walked out of Kepler's Reach had looked at it the same way when they first arrived, and had understood it completely only when they left. The outpost's best secret was not its tunnels or its hatches or its hidden corridors. Its best secret was much simpler than that. The best secret of Kepler's Reach was that it had never, not once, produced a single person who could not be broken. It had only ever produced people who had decided, in the dark and the cold and the exhaustion of those tunnels, that broken was not the same as done. And that was the only thing, in the end, that the Vreth Collective had never found in their intelligence reports, because it was not the kind of thing that showed up on a scan.